All right, welcome to DeCOMPOSED. It's our inaugural episode of our podcast about classical music and equity. I'm Calista Goldwasser. I'm a senior at DePauw University, and this is my friend Michaela.
Hi, I am Michaela Wolski. I am also a senior at DePauw University.
Today we've got a special guest joining us, our professor, Dr. Eliza Brown, who is the professor of theory and composition here at DePauw, but also just an excellent composer in her own right.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. We're so thrilled to have you. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself so we can get to know how you became the illustrious Dr. Eliza Brown that we know and love?
So do you want musical background or brief life history? What are we going for here?
I'd say musical background, something to just kind of lead into the rest of the questions.
Yeah, anything you feel like is relevant to kind of explaining how you got into composition, how you got into being a professor, all of that kind of stuff.
Sure. I fell in love with opera when I was 7, when my parents showed me Ingmar Bergman's Magic Flute movie version. And right around that time, I started taking cello lessons and I started composing. No one told me to start composing. I did it, but my parents' theory is that at the school I went to, there was a mantra that they gave to all the kids, which was, if you read, you write. And so their theory is that I applied this to music, and it was like, oh, well, if you take cello lessons, you clearly compose also. So, and then I kept composing from that point, started taking lessons in middle school, and went to University of Michigan to study composition, did a doctorate at Northwestern University in composition, and then came to DePauw for this job. And in a way, that sort of is like a list of bullet points, which doesn't honestly say that much about like who I am as an artist. It's a list of institutions, and institutions definitely shape us. But I think I had a lot of other formative musical experiences that weren't part of sort of prestige educational institutions that are still really important to me. So I grew up with like a culture of a lot of communal singing. I participated in all of the arts, not just music, and so that kind of interdisciplinary artistic background has continued to be very important to me. My mom is artistic, my sister is an architect, so there's a lot of sort of family conversation around, how things look, how things sound, how things feel, and why. A lot of just kind of everyday engagement with the arts as being like a part of daily life that was really important for me.
It's wonderful. That's totally not important to mention this, but my first opera I ever saw was also Magic Flute, and that was such a fun way to kind of get into the classical world. I feel like it fits so well with our modern like entertainment industry, and it's so neat to kind of have that as like a formative introduction into what otherwise feels like a very like dense and hard to get into as a kid art forms. That's really, it's very sweet.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of gender in music, or sort of issues of representation, I think the reason that the Ingmar Bergman version really drew me in at that time is that it starts with a camera angle on a little girl in the audience. And she is just watching intently while the whole overture happens. And they cut back to her several times over the course of the film and show reactions on her face. And so, if you are a kid, it's very relatable to see another kid reacting. And, that opera contains all kinds of problematic social content that I now know more about and can look at critically. But at the time, it was sort of a fantastical story that I was viewing through the perspective of someone I could relate to. So that idea of like representation on screen being a gateway to participation in the arts is something that I can relate to from that particular story.
You mentioned that like your mother was artistic and you grew up around kind of that sphere. Were there any other influences or role models that you saw, like female role models that you saw in the industry?
Yeah. I mean, I was so young when I started composing. I wasn't aware, like, that there was an industry. But someone who really comes to mind at that time in my life was one of the women who taught lower school at the school I went to, who's now a professional storyteller, and her name is Charlotte Alston. And so she does storytelling she's expert in a lot of different storytelling traditions of West Africa, of various cultures in the United States, particularly Black cultures in the United States. And so she has sort of developed her own storytelling style, and she's just captivating. And I remember being not in her class, but in a next door classroom as a kid. And I would like wander out of my classroom and like go just stand in the door while she was telling stories. And she uses musical instruments and she sings sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so I thought she was just, the most amazing thing, most amazing person and storyteller. Before I started composing, she's kind of the only person I can think of who I would call an influence.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful, though. I think it's so powerful to hear about the way that one's culture and one's like lived experiences kind of shape their music, and obviously that's something that's relevant to anyone and everyone who composes. There's no way to separate your own like personal life from, I personally think that like it's kind of hard to be completely detached, because music is such a personal thing, especially when it's coming from you directly. And I was curious, how do you feel like your identity as a woman, as an American, as a person surrounded by the arts, how do you feel like that has shaped the way that you compose?
Yeah, that is a huge and very interesting question. And I've thought about this a lot. And I find that it's interesting for me to think about ways in which, like, the sound of my music might be related to my gender. But that I have yet to come to any real conclusions about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In part because as soon as I formulate something in words, it sounds essentialist. Mm-hmm. So it sort of feels interesting for me to speculate about on a personal level, but then when I say it out loud, it starts feeling like I'm saying something about like what being a woman is.
Right. And there is no one definition of that.
Right.
Just like there is no one definition of what women composers create. That's not how that works.
Right.
Calista and I are... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Calista and I are in Dr. Harbert's Women in Western Music course at the moment, so we're learning a lot about like the role of feminine aesthetics in classical music. And it is interesting, like there is no one answer to anything.
Yeah. And so I don't feel like I have anything conclusive to say about sort of how the sound of my music reflects my gender, but I feel on more solid ground thinking and talking about, how I have chosen to embrace, in some cases, ways of doing music that are traditionally coded as female. Mm-hmm. And so an example of that is that I see composition as something that's like really fundamentally collaborative. And collaboration and relationship building is traditionally coded as female in, North American culture. And so that is something I have really consciously embraced, both as a way that I feel more comfortable making music within myself, as an approach to sort of engaging the industry that, isn't like some profound resistance of it, but is at least somewhat resistant of the idea that, composition is like this sort of competitive, hierarchical space where people can like win things and rise to the top and be the best composer. I'm not really interested in that. Yeah, and so I think that like when we ask questions about how can we make the field more equitable, that seeing composition as a domain of collaboration is one way of doing that. And I've had pushback on that from people who see things differently. So the most overt example was at one point when I was in Germany and I was talking to, really well-established opera conductor there. And I was telling him about how I wanted to sort of create operas through like this team approach, which is honestly, I mean, opera's already a team approach.
Yeah, doesn't sound that crazy, honestly.
Right. But the actual sort of writing of the music part. And he said, no. If you don't have a vision, you are weak.
I feel like that plays so much into that whole, like, idealized vision of what a great composer is, of this, like, super cerebral, creative thing that's all, like, trapped in someone's mind. And what?
Exactly. Yeah.
There's so many definitions of that.
Yeah. So to me, that read as being a really sexist comment.
Yep.
I don't think he was thinking about gender in making that comment.
Of course not.
And my response to that is like, I have a vision of this amazing collaborative process. But I see the field kind of moving in that direction, in many cases, prompted by the artistic work of people who don't identify as male, of people of color. So people who the industry has traditionally shut out are creating spaces where there's more space for collaboration and less of this kind of hierarchical genius model.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how the way that representation within classical music is not some kind of uniform blanket over all the different domains of classical music, that it's a lot less shocking to see women or people of color or any other underrepresented group represented in performance now, but yet we still see a big disconnect within the areas of classical music that hold more power, like composition, like conducting, like being chair of a music school or things like that, how it's not like this kind of uniform development. Is that something that you feel like you've experienced or kind of witnessed in making your way into academia or into composition?
Gosh, I think this is really complex.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really complex because the world of music is sort of a conglomeration of a lot of different institutions and spaces. And because the ways individuals operate in those spaces is intersectional.
100%.
And so we're sort of in like a 3 or 4 dimensional space here. Yeah. And so, when I was in undergrad, I think the advocacy that was happening for women composers was like very much a form of white feminism. So, it was pretty cool to say like we should be elevating more women, but the women that were elevated tended to be white. And there was very little discussion of race happening at all. And gender was very much being discussed as a binary. And some of even within the discussion of gender as a binary, some of the advice that I was getting about what it meant to make your way as someone who identifies female was very much based on sort of maleifying yourself.
Yep.
So like, wear blazers.
Wow.
So there was like recommendations to sort of conform to ideals of maleness as a woman so that you would be accepted in male spaces. So just with all of those examples, you can see how at that time, the discourse that, at least that I perceived as a student, the discourse that was happening was not acknowledging intersectionality, and was not extremely self-aware as a form of social advocacy. So I think that we've come a long way in terms of, people who are advocating for, more inclusive classical music spaces. The discourse has really deepened, and I think that's very much thanks to people who were previously left out of that discourse. Black people and trans people, and so people who have sort of given majority society the language to talk about intersectionality have been doing that within classical music spheres as well.
To think about so where do we go from here, which is a huge question that there is absolutely not an answer to, and I don't even want an answer. But when we think about how far classical music has come, but also how much room there is to grow, as young women in the classical music industry, or at least in the classical music academic sphere, what kinds of things can we implement just in our day-to-day existence as performers, as educators, to be more just aware, not even to make a huge worldly change to this, but just to make sure that we're being conscientious of beyond just the gender imbalance, but the various aspects of inequality that are built so deeply into classical music.
Well, I guess I would ask, why not make the big change? And of course I understand that change does not always happen overnight. But I think wish. We can't actualize something we don't imagine being possible. And so I think a lot about how do we create different infrastructures within the industry, and different working practices that reflect whatever values it is that we idealize. And for me, this comes from being sort of committed to analyzing how power flows and how institutions act structurally to include or exclude. And so I don't have control over every single institution, but I am sometimes in situations where I have some control. And so as an artist, I have control over, how my collaborative relationships are, or how the working processes for putting my music together are structured. So I'm really interested in maybe this could be sort of a piece of advice of the sort that you're asking about, that anytime you're in a position where you have a platform, who are you bringing onto that platform with you and how? And anytime you gain some form of power or influence, then what are you doing with it?
I think it's very profound to think about beyond just getting onto that platform, and what you say and what you do up there, but who can you bring with you? Because I've never thought about it that way. I've thought about, yes, I should advocate for, X identity and X group and all those kinds of things. If I ever end up in administrative positions, if I ever end up as a teacher who can advocate for other people, but I don't really think about it in the who can I bring up there with me kind of sense. And I think that's so simple, but it's so, and it feels so obvious when you say it like that, but I'm wow, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't think I've completely figured that out or done that perfectly at all times. But I do think that sort of looking at our working practices and the processes is really important. And so one area where this is true is certainly in opera production, there's a very, very traditional hierarchy in an opera house of like what everyone's title is, what everyone's job is in the company, like the timeline of how a new opera comes to the stage, is like a fairly rigid structure. And so when I was a kid, I really wanted to write opera, and I still do in some ways. But I have also found myself less interested in trying to sort of bend over backwards to like get into that structure as a composer, and more interested in finding ways to create opera-like substances sort of to the side of the industry, where everybody involved has the ability to shape their role in the collaboration and to decide on that collectively and make something together in a way that doesn't have to conform to those traditional hierarchies. Mm-hmm. So that was when I did my monodrama with Ensemble Daniente, that was a really profound experience because we weren't starting with a production company. We were starting with an ensemble that doesn't usually do theatrical production. And it was like, okay, what kinds of theater support do we need? Like, what kinds of artists do we need to do this? Do we need all of those roles filled that you would have in a traditional company? Do we know really amazing people who can kind of do 3.5 of those roles? Or do we need some kind of artist that a traditional theater company wouldn't have? So we were able to build the production in a way that felt egalitarian. And, it was a mostly all-female creative team. Me and 6 women who were incarcerated in Indiana Women's Prison creative team. And then the production team was also primarily female. And so it felt like this profoundly different space than anything else I had experienced in the realm of production.
Yeah.
Do you feel like putting the labels that classical music, or like the genre types that classical music has developed and given such a specific definition to, as something that can be, obviously it can be very limiting. Do you think there's a way to almost reclaim those same forms and to say, yes, I understand that opera has a certain skeleton that it's expected to like fill out, but is there a way to kind of meld this idea of creating an opera in a non-opera format and bring that back into the world of opera, which has a lot of pressure to kind of fit what the donor generation would like it to be, but also get a little mainstream? I would say opera is mainstream, but that's not really true. But in the classical world, at least, it's mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I understand what you're getting at there, in the sense that like opera, it may not be mainstream, but it has a lot of social capital.
Yeah. That people, when they hear opera, are like, oh yes, I'd love to go see it, or they probably don't say that. But, classical music snobs say that, at least. And
I think about this in the sense that, yes, so like opera has a lot of social capital, and if we can sort of think of genres as having privilege, like opera is a very privileged space. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's sort of for me, the way to like use that privileged space is to then say, that's a platform, right? So like, what stories are we going to put on that platform? How can we take some of the privilege that this space confers and like redistribute it so that it's not just social capital that continues to accrue to the same people or groups that have already had it. And, maybe that's not radical enough. Maybe we should be trying to sort of get rid of the idea of social capital altogether. But I do think that is one way that opera institutions can go, and you certainly see some companies starting to think that way. Both in terms of who they're commissioning, who their performers are, what stories they're commissioning to be told on the stage. And also just structurally, like, what is opera? Like, Yuval Sharon is doing super interesting stuff. He's in Detroit now. They just did like updated version of Gotterdammerung in a parking garage. So yeah, I mean, so if we're thinking about sort of questions of like access and representation, like if you're in Detroit and it's a pandemic, you know, and you do an updated version of an opera that has like Motown arrangements and that people can sit in their cars in a parking garage and watch, you know, in a city where the automobile has been like this huge part of cultural history, economic history. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, very.
I would like to ask a question. So, like, again, talking about opera, and I know you mentioned that that was a big part of, like, your musical upbringing and inspiration. What advice would you give to either your younger self or young women who had a similar experience and who want to go into classical music?
Yeah, this one's also difficult for me because I just know that, like, so much of the advice I got when I was young told me more about what the other person had experienced than it did about what I would need to know in the future. And that's always sort of bothered me about advice in general. Yeah. But I think I've come to appreciate that more recently, because I feel like it's actually really helpful because it gave me a window into sort of like my history. Mm-hmm. You know, where like I had a composition teacher who was a woman, and her advice to me was, you know, don't marry someone who won't let you have a place to work. And it was like she had experienced that, and so that was her advice. You know, she had to get up when she was a young mother of a newborn, was like getting up at 4 a.m. to compose in the stairwell before her baby and her husband woke up, and she had to go take care of them.
Wow.
And so her advice reflected that experience.
Yeah.
And for me, that was sort of like unthinkable that would be something I would consent to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's so powerful to think about where people have been to achieve the things that we kind of take for granted at this point. To have the space to be creative and the space to do the things we're passionate about.
Yes. And I think it also really drives home how recent some of these gains are.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because that woman is still alive. And, you know, people who gave me advice to wear blazers are still alive. So,
people who wear
you know,
blazers are still alive.
Sometimes I like blazers. I mean, I don't mind blazers, but I want to wear them because I like them, not because I think they're my ticket into doing art that I want to do.
There should be a way to be respected in a dress.
Yeah, exactly. There's a great op-ed from a few years back by the composer Kristen Custer about that, called "Taking Off My Pants." So, highly recommended read.
Yeah, I'm looking that up right now.
Yeah.
Nothing sounds better.
But yeah, so I mean, I think like my advice would be, you know, don't be afraid to think and talk about how your identities affect your experience as a musician, and to talk about that with other people, and to do that in a way that acknowledges intersectionality. I think we're unlikely to make much progress if we can't see those things.
Agreed.
And I think, I mean, I definitely experienced situations where I was sort of suffering in silence because there was no vocabulary and no discourse about the experiences I was having. Or I didn't know that something was wrong because there was no vocabulary and discourse to describe what was wrong.
Yeah, when it's so ingrained into the structures of the form, it's hard to even recognize that there's a problem there. Mm-hmm. Like it's already kind of, I don't want to say revolutionary, that makes it sound way more dramatic than it is, but I'm going to say it anyway. Revolutionary to think about not gendering terms like conductor and composer, and, you know, using like they singular instead of he when we speak about an unnamed example of what would have been a traditionally masculine role, and things like that, of just little things you're like, hey, maybe we should work on that, but you don't even notice it until you come at it with the lens of intersectionality, with the lens of equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, it's everywhere.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, just having language to name your own experience is really important. Yeah, and so as you're saying, Calista, if our language only reflects a dominant experience, then a lot of people are going to be left without that language.
Yeah. You don't even notice that it should until someone brings it up. And you don't even think anything of it. You're just like, yeah, that's what we say about, you know, roles that end with ER, probably. Call them all he.
Right.
And, you know, so many other things beyond that, but that just seems so, like, on the nose almost.
Right. Yeah, and that it, you know, it leads to this situation where, like, people who identify as male are not usually asked about their experience as a male composer.
We don't call them male composers. We just call them composers.
Right. And I don't mind talking about my experience as a female composer. I think it's important, as we were just saying. But the fact that one of those things is sort of normative and the other is not is also problematic. And it's the same for, you know, people who are Black or any race other than white. You know, they're often referred to in these ways that are marked.
It'd be interesting to see a world where we don't have to have supplementary courses to discuss women in music and mandatory courses to discuss the Western canon, which includes some women, but it's mostly white women who also, you know, had a respected composer husband or composer brother, or were literally a nun. Like, it's interesting. Obviously, we have to start somewhere. If we don't have courses that discuss women in music at all, that's even worse. But it'd be interesting to see a way to incorporate the discussion of those composers more directly into a canonized curriculum, rather than as a supplemental thing that if you happen to care about that, then yeah, by all means, let's learn about it. But that everyone actually gets the same starting point.
That's the big questions of curriculum right now, and not just in music. Is what is central in what we teach and why.
And it's way better to, and I'm really enjoying learning about women in Western music in this specialized, narrowly, like, centralized just around that kind of setting, but at the same time it makes you think about how many things the peers that aren't in the class are missing out on, like, by not being included, or not included, they could be if they wanted to, but not being brought into that directly. Right.
Well, it's the thing of, like, if your history is elective and someone else's history is required. I have been thinking a lot about this concept of markedness and unmarkedness that comes from linguistics, where if something is unmarked, then it's sort of like the normative, sort of easy, centralized version of a thing. And then if something is marked, you know, it's the woman composer versus composer. So the composer is unmarked and the woman composer is marked. And there are many ways that, you know, language and curriculum and all these other social structures reflect these kind of mass dominant culture assignations of markedness and unmarkedness.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Well, it sounds like we're coming to a close. We've covered almost every single question that we've asked, or that we've had on the list. But we want to close it off with asking, like, what kind of projects you've worked on or are working on, and yeah.
Sure. Well, the kind of most immediate one is something I'm very excited about. It's an interdisciplinary collaborative project that the group has been working together for a while at this point. We were really slowed down by the pandemic. But at any rate, so this group is a visual artist, a poet, an animator, a violinist, and me, and a stage set designer, kind of producer person. And we are creating a performance installation piece that is kind of a realization of an art book that the visual artist and poet already did together. So they had made this book through a really intense collaboration, and they felt like sort of the life of this material was not over, that it had more things to do. So they kind of pulled the rest of us together, and said, we want to like temporalize this book into a performance piece. So we've been building it really slowly, but I just have so much respect for this group of people. And it's a very egalitarian kind of democratic process, which also means it's slow.
Yeah.
We have to make a lot of sort of consensus decisions. But I really like working that way. And, I wish that we weren't under such time pressure to produce all the time. The sort of like capitalistic production imperative for artists that exists in the world can be really narrow, can make what projects you take on more narrow, because they have to exist within certain frames of time. So I really like that this group has resisted that, and it's like, we're just going to keep building this for as long as it takes to make it, and we're going to figure out how to stage it and where, because there aren't spaces that are built for this kind of work. A few, but most of the world is sort of divided into theaters that do theater and galleries that put art on the walls and concert halls that do music. And so when you're working in between all of those things, then it's this double-edged sword. It's like we get to create our own infrastructure, and also we have to create our own infrastructure.
With that, I guess we'll wrap it all up and just say thank you again for joining us on this. It was such a wonderful time to get into what's a really weighty and complicated discussion, and so valuable to open up in hopefully a podcast that people listen to, fingers crossed. But even if not, just for the two of us to have had this experience is really, really wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This has been a really wonderful conversation.